Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Jordan. We're
Oh,
finally on the podcast.
jeez, yeah. Sorry about that, man. Life
Nah,
gets a bit
man,
crazy.
I understand completely. Listen, I'm gonna run down real quick over Dr. Jordan's just everything that he has so that you guys understand how much time this guy has available. So this is like a miracle moment, right? So Dr. Jordan Shallow, thank you for being on the show. If you're listening to the Blaze Camp Performance Podcast, this is a chiropractor, performance coach, HD muscle supplement athlete. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of these. Prescript co-founder, founder of a certification program.
Yeah.
RX radio host, co-host, founder also.
Yep.
And medical director of House of Athletes.
Yep.
Just anything else?
What else did I do? Oh yeah, I co-founded a software company 2 years ago that'll launch in the next couple of months. So that's called Platform, and we're very excited about it.
See, there you go, folks. There's not a lot of time, so we got to get right into it. If you don't know about Dr. Jordan Shallow, please look him up. There's a lot of information out there. And just on the RX Radio podcast, you're just going to find all kinds of gems. And I'll tell you just a quick thing, Dr. Shallow, episode 143.
Okay.
I know. Don't worry about the number.
I don't know what
get
it
it.
is. I have no
I
idea
know
what
you
it
have
is.
over 300 episodes. Listen, episode 143, when you first spoke about Dr. Pat Davidson,
Yeah.
was the beginning of me just breaking out of one model of training and then looking at when you said tensegrity model, and I was like, exploded, right? And then I went into digging in what all these IRs, ERs, things happened. Eventually landed with Bill Hartman and Derek Hansen, which eventually landed me onto getting a certification into a sprinting coach, which eventually landed me into training pro athletes. So the only way that I was able to just get out of my own head in format of one model and be able to look at pro athletes and say, oh, this is completely different than what the book says, was because episode 143 of your podcast.
That is
right?
wild.
Wild,
Yeah,
because
insane.
It's insane to me because I understood some of the concepts that trainers were like looking into how to sell and how to market online. And I thought that was it. Like, I'm going to have a successful sales process to my gym and that's going to be great. But I kind of just didn't have the service that I knew there was other levels to until episode 143 unlocked the doors to just this whole array of like, oh, that's what I needed. This is why this is not working. So just, I wanted to thank you personally first for just unlocking that door and bringing in just gems into the podcast. Thank you for that.
Dude, to be listed in the same breath as some of those guys is all the thanks I need.
I mean, it's amazing. You're one of the GOATs. Just the whole team that you guys have is amazing. So I don't want to talk too much about that, more the history and all that, but let's get right into some of the questions that I have. Are you actively more right now a performance coach or also chiropractor, both, or more chiropractor? Do you still dab in that, or?
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, this is going to be so annoying because I'm sure your podcast is riddled with the answer. It depends, but it depends on the severity of like the injury or dysfunction or malfunction or overuse or misuse that I deal with. Like, you know, if you look at movement on a spectrum from like passive, active assisted, active, active resisted, my goal is to always operate more on the performance end. But if someone falls so far down that movement potential spectrum where passive enters into the equation for them and what they need, then I'm act more like a chiropractor, more hands-on. But the goal is to get them into that active assisted, active, and then ultimately active resisted as quickly as I can. So it's like, if I'm a chiropractor, I'm trying to be a chiropractor for that patient for as little as humanly possible, or for the least amount of time as humanly possible. But it does enter into my purview every now and then. But it would depend entirely on like the performance state of the athlete that I'm training. Now, you know, right now we're headed into combine season. So I'm probably going to be trying to do even less on the chiropractic manual side because we have a little over 8 weeks right now until the combine in Indianapolis. So I'm trying, performance is top of mind. And for some kids, man, performance is going to be on the table, but for the majority of them, it's going to be on the gym floor. So it's a case by case basis. But I guess if I had to average out over my week, I probably am acting more like a performance coach, let's say 90+% of the time.
Yeah, okay, I understand that. So it's you just tone up the volumes on each one of those as needed, and you just regulate as far as what the athlete needs, which is essentially where I wanted to get started on, because as trainers, not as doctors, let's say trainers that are just getting certified, there's a new array of information that's coming out where a trainer is almost like tapping into, do I need to be a physical therapist? Do I need to put my hands on people? A lot more of understanding injuries and understanding training models that help people get better? Or should I stay on the performance side? So my question would start with, let's say, for example, I get certified right now on a general certification, an NASM, and ISA, whatever, and anything. How much should an average trainer start dabbing into those other ranges of the spectrum, in your opinion?
Yeah, I wouldn't start there, right? Like I think you got to get your reps in. Ultimately, I know a lot of people in manual medicine are very protective over their like doctor title, and that's fine. Like it's hard and it's expensive and it's time consuming and all that, but assessing and diagnosing are essentially the same thing. But above both of those terms is just pattern recognition, right? So I think whether you want to call it diagnosing if you're some sort of clinician, if you want to try call it assessment, if you're some sort of, like you mentioned, a new personal trainer, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is recognize patterns. And if we kind of look how like a machine learning algorithm would work, this the more data, the more accurate the pattern recognition process, right? Like, an automated driving system, it gets better with every accident, where you might get a little bit worse with every accident. If a car gets in an accident, and it's part of an automated driving machine learning algorithm, then all other cars now learn that use case that led to an accident. So all cars can then bring that into the collective aggregate of driving scenarios, and the likelihood of that scenario happening again goes down, right? So I guess the idea is, as a new trainer, like you just want to get, you're almost like a client learning an exercise. It's like you don't want to over cue a client in a new exercise, because you need to have a pattern to manipulate first, right? You need to allow them to express the pattern that they're going to bias in a particular movement. So just as a new trainer, it's like you don't have enough data points to begin to work on the fringes and extrapolate out from. So I think for me personally, and like there's a lot that goes into the theoretical side of training. But there's a lot that goes into the practical side of training that both drives and curtails the theoretical side of training. Like I'll talk to strength coaches online who don't really do it in person, which is, I don't know how you're a strength coach and not doing it in person. And it's like, they talk about program design. I'm like, look, a well-run program is way better than a well-designed program, right? Like the constraints of your environment are huge. Like we're gonna have 29 college kids in the fucking building that we'll probably see, 29 of them go in the NFL draft. And it's like, that you got to be able to run a program, right? Like you got to be able to run a session. Fuck designing a program. I've seen some of the like theoretically worst designed programs be the best run sessions, and I'll take a well-run session over a good well-designed program any day of the week. So, but you only learn that from like really being in the space and like really like, just getting it in your hands and getting it under your, like between your toes, and understanding like just like logistics really. And if you're aware of the patterns that you need to recognize going into it, then as your trainer, like, okay, once you can build a client base and begin to standardize your environment, then you might be able to take a toe out of your comfort zone with some of your theoretical knowledge, because you have a base that is a constant. But if your base is variable, there's nothing to retest against. There's no verification process, right? And I would argue that a lot of clients get results in spite of what trainers do, not because of what trainers do. And without that base, it's really hard to draw a conclusion or a straight line between an intervention and a result if there's so many variables at play. And it's like, I don't know. I like being a chiropractor because I have that option to put hands on people. People are gross. I don't want to touch people. Get the fuck out of here. I'd much rather be able to like have your nervous system do what I want it to do
Right.
rather than use my nervous system to intervene. And it's the whole thing. So yeah, for a lot of reasons, I think, people might err to the side of trying to look smarter or whatever. It's like, fuck, man, I know a ton of chiropractors that I wouldn't deem quote unquote smart. And I know a ton of performance coaches who don't know a single insertion or origin, but they know shapes, they know slow when they see it, they know fast when they see it. It's like, give me that pattern recognition all day. So I guess the too long didn't read version of that is, yeah, get your reps in, but understand like they're only useful reps if you're looking for those patterns, right? Because that's what the books can't teach you. But a lot of times people like age is no sign of experience, youth is no sign of creativity. So a lot of people are like, yeah, I've been doing this for 20 years. I was like, great, you haven't learned shit in 20 years if you're not paying attention. So I think that's sort of like, yeah, obviously get your reps in, but understand the value of each rep as a data point that you're trying to collect, so that when you do have a solid base under you, you can start to make some informed decisions about, how your interventions might change the objective outcome.
Right. I mean, the hardest part is you graduate from your certification or even from college, it doesn't matter. And you just don't know, do I do 3 sets of the warm up, 2 sets of the warm up? Those nuances become like, it really stops you, as a new trainer. But it also, on the same flip side of that, I see athletes and let's say you give them an intervention and they're like, are you a physical therapist? I don't know what this is. So sometimes there's a certain level of athleticism in athletes that they just kind of back off like, wait, I think this is different than training. What am I doing this for? What do you think the athlete should be looking out for when a trainer wants to give them things that might be outside of their scope of practice? Also, like, because I have the podcast where there's trainers that listen in and we go over some of the concepts of training, but I also have athletes that listen, and high school athletes, college athletes, pro athletes that listen to podcasts, and they ask me these questions about, about massing and different things. But I also want to give them some perspective on what should they watch out for when they see a trainer. How would that look like? Have you seen that?
Yeah, it's funny because I interact in like a very short window with college athletes, like once a year. Like I don't work for a team. We work like HOA is a private organization. So I get a collective consciousness of the athletic training staff across the country of every Division I school you can think of, because I'm dealing with these players that have had nagging injuries from literally every school in America. So, and it's funny because this question comes up a lot because they don't know, right? They need to remember their routes and they need to remember to go to their classes and they need to remember their girl's birthday or whatever. Like they don't also need to be physical therapists or chiropractors or whatever on top of it. I think the number one thing that an athlete should keep in mind is like just how rare their abilities are. And it's one thing to know like the human body, but an athlete will, for the most part, depending on the skill level practitioner, always know their body best, which is something that doesn't reign true of people who are relatively unskilled, right? Like if someone walks in my door and they're just a soccer dad that's maybe played high school football but hasn't worked out in 20 years, I'm going to defer to my expertise and my diploma with my name on my wall for clinical decision making. Not that I'm going to ignore everything that they're going to have to say, but in the evidence-based stool that props up my practice, whether it's like one leg is going to be my clinical experience and that pattern recognition, another is going to be like best research and practice in literature, and others going to be patient values. It's like, all right, well, anything shy of this person really not liking an intervention or finding it extremely painful, I'm probably just going to go with my experience on this particular case. But with an athlete, I think they should be more confident in understanding their uniqueness of physical ability and how that places them on the spectrum of what most therapists and trainers are used to. Because I had this, I have a kid with clocked a 4.240 out of, I don't want to say what school, and he's dealing with an issue of like osteitis pubis, and some of the exercises they're doing, I'm like, this would probably make it worse. And he keeps asking these questions, and he's not getting the right answers. So I think that right there, and like instilling the confidence in him, and like, look, man, like you're a guy, like you're a guy, you're gonna be a household name in a few years. Like you'll sign for a couple million, and if you get a big boy contract, like you're a dude. And so you need to protect that. So if you're not happy with the answers you're getting, man, I mean, I had this when I was in practice at Apple. Outside of school, I was a chiropractor at world headquarters in Cupertino, California, and I dealt with a lot of like software engineers, and they're all like very, on the spectrum, very highly intelligent, double PhD from MIT, Ivy League, postdoc kind of crowd, and they're just curious, and they would ask me questions about interventions, about exercises, about treatment modalities. And I realized that some of the answers, when I boiled down to it, were just like, when they asked me why, I just said, I don't know, because like I paid a lot of money and this is what someone told me to. Like I had to just suspend a lot of my belief systems and actually come up with tangible answers. And then there's a process of making palatable something that is very complex. And I think that's also something that trainers nowadays are being fed, that the body is not complex. I've told the story a few times in the last week because it's probably like one of the more profound conversations I've had in a while. I was sitting down, I had dinner with, he's a medical doctor who's, his claim to fame is his major patient that he sees on a monthly basis. His name is Harry Kane, a striker in the Premier League. Guy's probably like a $600-700 million contract type guy. And so I was having dinner with him. He's very like eccentric Spanish dude. And we were talking about biomechanics, and we're talking about, one of Harry's injuries or whatever. And he gets so frustrated because he teaches some stuff as well. And he's like, I don't get it. And he's got this like really cool, like Basque country accent, like Northern Spain. And he's like, people want to make it so simple. Like, if you want to fix something simple, fix fucking bicycles. And I was like, oh man, that really hit for me, because there is a complexity to it. But yeah. I think, in short, to answer your question, I mean, a lot of it, like all things athletes, it's intuitive, right? So if your intuition tells you like, hey, this doesn't resonate, this doesn't make sense to me, keep asking the question why until it does. And if it doesn't, then keep looking for a practitioner until you get that answer that resonates with you, because it's a different frequency that you're operating at. There's a different resonance, that you're playing different movement notes. Like those athletes are just different. And if you can't explain it to an athlete to a point where it makes sense to them, you should either dispense with the movement or dispense with that trainer or coach.
Yeah, the hardest part has been for me to let the athletes know that sometimes it's okay to let go of that coach, or it's okay to let go of that trainer. And I don't necessarily tell them to come with me. I tell them, look, if it's not working and you have 6 weeks left and it's the same thing, it's a very tough decision for a lot of these athletes, because, hey, I'm peaking. I don't have a lot of time. And then I have to go test to see which one works. It's tough. How do you see that side? Like, how would you recommend athletes go about that side of like detaching from what they're already doing or been doing?
Yeah, I mean, the adage of what got you where you were is not going to get you to where you want to go, I think, is one that lands pretty well with most people. A lot of it, and God bless them, like these kids are so unbelievably loyal. And I think that's where the issues, I don't say issues, but that's where a lot of the friction comes, is it's just, this has been, it was this high school strength coach. And it's like, dude, you're 6'4", 235, and you run like a 4.35. You could have had your kindergarten teacher be your strength coach, and you probably would have been in the same place. So a lot of it is like appealing to the more human side of like, I don't think it's necessarily, because they don't know what their strength coach does and they don't know what you do. So they're like, why would they go with the poison they don't know rather than the poison they know? But I think it's really more appealing to like the loyalty side, and saying that it is okay, like, to evolve out. And I think in part, some of it's on the coaches, because obviously if you have a coach that's like your guy, or if you're a coach and you have like a guy who's, shows a lot of promise, it helps, man. Trust me. Like, I get this. I live it every day of my life. Like, there's an inherent value of being trusted by the people that trust me to work with them. I understand that from a brand perspective. I understand that from a business and financial perspective. So to take that away is tough, but to be secure enough in your coaching ability to be like, all right, like, you're going to have to let a few people go if it's not a good fit. And I think that makes it a little bit easier for the universe to kind of go through that series of checks and balances. Like, if I'm okay giving up like a 5-star guy, then there's a 5-star guy out there that'll find me as a better solution. But I think a lot of people get a little scarce in their mindset with athletes, because there's not a lot of them out there. But I mean, if you have the athlete's best intention and outcomes in mind. Knowing when, knowing enough to know when you're not the guy is, I think, is super helpful, and it's super freeing. Like, you can do a lot more with your time rather than trying to work outside of your scope. Like, I have a massive team that if something is and falls out of my field of expertise, which is like what I think to be fairly narrow, I can pick up the phone and get them on a plane to Spain, to Toronto, to Australia, to South Florida, to LA, have them work with someone who is directly in the crosshairs of their problem. So I think it's twofold. It's like taking the ownership on yourself as a coach to be like, hey, I'm willing to give someone up for the betterment of them. And I think that will start a trend of athletes not feeling the same sort of guilt that comes with leaving a coach, and coaches being like, no, it's cool, man. Like, you go try new things, and if it works, then fuck yeah, and if not, but that's the risk you're going to have to take at the end of the day as an athlete, and that's part of the process ultimately.
Yep, I agree with that, and it's like you said, it's part of the coach's responsibility to let them know that it's their career. It's not holding on to the athlete because it's your career. It's helping the athlete as they go through your life and move on to the rest of their career, right? And in a way, how do you see the transition? I know you have high school athletes and then college athletes and then pro athletes. I personally see, a certain type of strength and conditioning coaches in high school, and then I see a different type of strength and conditioning coaches in college. And the college ones, I don't know if the data is true, but I've seen some data show, like, basically, like, at college level, a lot of the athletes, they actually don't get better necessarily in their skill because of the amount of in-gym training that they've been having. I don't know how accurate that is, but do you see some of that happening? Because I have some high school athletes in baseball right now that are transferring over to college, and I've been telling them, hey, make sure that when you go out there, everything you do in the gym, if they're clocking it and they're saying, oh, I took his deadlift from 5 to 600, make sure you're getting a result in the field at the same time, not just trying to push for the results on the gym. How do you see that happening right now?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to, I think, the human side. Like, I 100% agree with you, and I don't have the statistics, but I've seen enough kids go through high school and college and into pros to kind of see that same trend. And a lot of it's just self-preservation on behalf of the strength coach, right? Like, understanding the bureaucracy behind collegiate level strength coaching is a lot of times they have a tie to the performer or to the head coach, right? So the player coach moves, all of a sudden they're going to bring in a new training staff. But also, like, the role of the strength coach in the culture of the team at the college level is very different, right? Culture is really built in the weight room for college sports, which is super interesting because that's not at all what happens at the pro level, or even to a certain degree the high school level. There's just such a difference between someone who's in the 9th grade and someone in the 12th grade. Much closer are the experience of someone who's like a sophomore versus someone who's a senior or something like that, or a junior versus senior. So I think there's, from a strength coach perspective in college, I think the volume is way too high. I think the amount of time they spend in is way too high. I think at large, the emphasis that is going to make them good at their sport depreciates, I think, year over year, right? Especially as you get guys, especially with COVID, man, I'm seeing red-shirted sophomores at 22 years old, right? So I got a guy with 4 years of eligibility who's 22 years old. He's 4 years of NCAA. So it's like, this guy's going to be, it could be, he'll go probably next year, but technically speaking, he could be eligible for the draft coming out of college at 26 years old, right? So it's like, when we start to look at training adaptations and where we see our highest yield weighted variables and actually on the field of play, whether that's agility, whether that's endurance, whether that's power, whether that's speed, it's likely going to be strength, right? Top end strength is going to be, if I have a kid in high school, it's like, if I can get him to squat 400 pounds, like, he's probably going to be doing pretty good on all aspects of all, like, meaningful training adaptations. He's going to be doing well. There's a certain point where strength becomes a depreciating return, and there's a certain point where the means by which you need to get stronger in itself are depreciating just for how much time they take. Like, it's not as hard to get a 16-year-old kid stronger relative to his baseline strength than it is to get a 22-year-old stronger relative to his baseline strength. So it's doubly inefficient, where it's like, okay, now as they get older into their college. And two, my audio
you cut out. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, sorry, I had someone attempt to call me.
You got it again. You're good. I can't hear you, but there you go.
2 seconds.
You're back.
If this person calls me back, so we'll edit this shit out. Apology. So from a efficiency perspective, you reach a certain point of strength in high school where you're as strong as you necessarily need to be for the game, right? You've tapped the well of that adaptation dry. So getting stronger isn't going to be the thing that correlates to the game. And don't get me wrong, like there's kids that go into college programs that probably still could get a bit stronger. But by the time you come out of college, or even like, a year or two into a college program, you're likely where you need to be as far as your sports demand. And so now all of a sudden you're going to sink more time into a process that's not going to yield you as much result. And it's actually going to cost you more time because it is harder to get those adaptations later in your teenage years up into your 20s.
Right.
So I think that's an emphasis that needs to kind of be monitored. It's like, all right, well, what is the highest return of the time we spend in the gym? And if we are more efficient with the time we spend in the gym, we could likely spend less time in the gym. So I think the culture behind strength and conditioning, and that's why I really like the language shift in the last 5 years or so from strength and conditioning coach to performance coach, because it was literally strength and conditioning coach was less a job title and more of a checklist. Did we do strength work today? Check.
Right.
Did we do conditioning work today?
Check.
And it's like, well, that's not really what the job is, right? So
Right.
performance is more encompassing of the actual outcomes. Like, do they perform better on a Sunday?
Right.
Check. So
Yeah, I
think
have
there's definitely.
that's definitely true. I have a boxer that trains with us, Raphael. He's a Nigerian boxer. He's US based. He's a heavyweight. He's 14-0, 6'9", 265. Like, this guy is a machine. But there's no conditioning I need to do with him, because after I train with him for strength, he goes to the track for track and field for another hour. And then after that, at night, he does boxing. So I'm not going to condition him. I'm not going to need to condition anything. He's already conditioned. I'll just work on the strength and try to save as much energy as I can so he can go condition at the track and at his boxing. And doing his skill is already part of the conditioning, So I completely agree with that. It's a performance-based models that are coming out of the woodworks and just being able to get better. And I think it's tapping into general population too. Like, there's a lot of CrossFit coaches that have started to learn more about the strength and conditioning divisions of all that. Have you seen any of that happening into Gen Pop, like kind of like the more advanced training leading into the local gyms?
Yeah. And I never thought I'd see the day when I was a kid. I grew up training in this gym in Canada called Good Life Fitness. It was almost like the equivalent of our LA Fitness. And the owner was kind of famous. I worked in the company at the age of 16, and the owner was kind of famous of every square inch of that gym had to be covered in machines. If there was a spot where you could fit a machine, he was putting a machine there. And then what ended up happening was, now I go back as an educator with my company 10 years later, 12 years later, and there's these turf zones, and there's these little tire flippy stations, and there's sleds, and there's crawlers, and there's squat racks, and there's space to just move, and there's plyo boxes and all that. And it's it's good. And it's body weight exercises when you're weaker than the forces of gravity acting on you are a complete fucking nightmare. Right. So it's good to I guess see and maybe raise some awareness or set that as a trajectory outside of just trying to make your clients really bad bodybuilders, which is the majority of personal training. But I think understanding the power of some of these tools and what we're using them for, if you have a flat tire on the side of the road, just put the jack under the back quarter panel of the car, lift it up with a fucking hand jack, and then just change your goddamn tire. You don't need a DuPont air-driven compressor, fucking
right.
And it's that's what some of those tools are, man. And they're tools that only work in high stress environments, right? Fast is fast. So,
Yeah.
so a med ball throw for someone who's like not really strong enough to twist and rotate. Or my cat is like really interested in the
That's
camera.
fine. Yeah, that's fine.
It's like, well, you're not driving the same adaptation, right? A lot of times what you're probably driving is you're actually driving a novel strength adaptation, but they're just way better tools to do it, right? Like if I wanted to put a hole in my wall, I could use my fist, or I could use like I don't know, a slug from a shotgun. What's going to have more collateral? It's like, well, probably if I punch a hole through a wall, that's going to suck way more than if I just shoot a hole through a wall.
Right.
And it's like some of these tools, they think they're just, the outcome is the same. The med ball gets thrown, but the collateral that you're going to carry with it, having some rapid transverse plane trunk rotation exercise to someone who can't decelerate, who can barely even stand up without falling over, that's a different outcome that carries
Right.
with it more collateral than like, you know, a second year college wide receiver, you know what I mean? So
Right.
it's good to see, but I think a lot of times and because it's simple, it's not machinery. I think it just lends to the further importance of like the actual, you know, education and ingenuity of a strength coach, because these tools, when used improperly, man, I've seen way more bad things go wrong with Gen Pop doing these like, you know, basic plyometric stuff. It's like there's no such thing as basic plyometrics, right? Like plyometric
Functional.
is such a dude, and I've just seen it go wrong way more times than I've seen it go right in these circles, because
Right.
it's just, they are powerful tools with very specific use cases, and a lot of times general fitness is not the use case that they're meant for.
So that takes me to the next point where let's say we're getting into the exercise side of it, and what do you think is missing from the certification programs to, and maybe Prescript has built the answer into what's missing, and what do you think is missing to connect the dots for trainers? Because let's say I get certified, I didn't know, so I'm talking to you like when I first got certified, I did not know what to do, even though I was told you're good to go. What do you think it's missing? Because we walk now into a gym, a 24-hour fitness, to say, or an LA Fitness, wherever, that has a turf, and I have the functional free pieces, and I also have the machines. What is the common theme that you're seeing where it's getting stuck and we need more information so we can utilize tools correctly?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is just the distance that you create between yourself and the average person in a gym just by your own physical ability. Like a question I usually ask in starting off seminars is, you know, how long has everyone been training for? Like, how old were you when you started training? And you get like, you know, like, oh, like 18, 16. You get like the odd kid who's like, I started training in my garage with my dad when I was like 12. And you're like, okay, sick. You're like, that sounds awesome. But you never get someone who's a personal trainer that's like, oh, I didn't really start till I was like 45. And you're like, all right, I've had plenty of clients in my day that haven't started training until the age of 45.
Right.
So we have a curriculum that's made, you know, not we, but, and, you know, I went through the same certifications when I was younger as well. So you have a curriculum that's made by enthusiasts that have always been on the leading edge of their, you know, their physical literacy. And they've always had, you know, complete control of, you know, their body's interaction with the ground and gravity, where that, you know, I would look at someone who swings a golf club and be like, holy shit, like that's crazy. Like watching Bryce DeChambeau swing his club speed had like, I don't know, his club speed's going like 131 miles per hour. And I watch him do that and smash like 400 plus straight down the pipe. It's like, holy shit, that's wild. And I look at that, I'm like, that's a skill. And so if I know by looking at that and giving my current ability with golf, I would have to really practice the skill. I would need to get a coach, and I would spend time, and I wouldn't be expecting to like just be driving these bombs every day. But so we know that, right? Even me, who's, you know, I've been on the leading edge of my relationship with gravity and the ground my entire life. As I've physically developed, my strength was always on the leading edge of that. But what we miss is like, we miss that clientele that's like, whoa, they can't really start thinking about, you know, golf clubs and baseball bats and all that until they actually can control themselves. Like controlling all these other implements, forget about it. Like, let's control yourself first. Let's familiarize relationship, or let's familiarize you with the relationship that you have with gravity and the ground. And then once you can do that and kind of get them stronger than the forces of gravity acting on them, now they're in a position where they have infinite variability in movements that they can perform. So I think what's missing from the language and something we focus on is identifying that, look, like you're not your client, number one, but more specifically, exercises that you deem as just things that you just go do and train to failure are actually more like that golf swing that we watch on TV. They're probably more things that need to be practiced and are skills that need to be honed in on before we can start increasing the the intensity or the velocity or the duration or whatever training adaptation we're trying to drive. So I think that gets lost because you get a bunch of dudes and girls that are into fitness in a room with each other, and they start talking about developing curriculum. Meanwhile, they're developing curriculum for everyone else that's not in the room, that right. Doesn't have the same relationship with resistance, that doesn't have the same relationship of, call it kinesthetic awareness, call it proprioception, call it relative strength to body weight ratio. So I think that's the biggest thing that's missing, is like just having like some sort of physical empathy and being like, okay, this person is relatively detrained. What is it like to never lift a weight in your life? And then to be the first person to be, allocating that stimulus to someone, it's a big responsibility. And I think a lot of people lose that because they're programming through their own physical ability.
Right. So it's the language. It's a language thing that we need to add on. Do you also see a segmentation of concepts that needs to be added? Because when I saw you guys had a seminar here in Miami at Hybrid, and we were talking about like segmenting, like, look, listen, if you're gonna train for speed, try to understand what the volume of speed, what is slow, what's medium, what's fast. If you're going to train for strength, well, what's weak, what's normal, what's your body weight, what's resistance outside of yourself. Kind of like segmenting buckets of when you're training. I didn't see any of that. I just saw a list of saying, these are variabilities in training. It's like, okay, I get it. I can stand on the Bosu ball. I can stand on the ground. That's a variability. And I understand high proprioceptive environment, low proprioceptive environment in theory. That's what it said on the book. When I actually took it to the floor, I was like, well, which one do I need? Because I didn't know what I was training for. So the training goals became, okay, that's where we're going. Do I need the Bosu ball squat or do I need the floor squat? Because I don't know which. So I didn't know how to take my assessments into the actual training floor. Is there a way that you think that we can start understanding concepts as themselves? Do you see like things like that coming out? Because I know that you guys in Prescript are coming out with like skill acquisition and then barbell concepts. And then these things that are like just put together into, look, if you're going to train for this, these are the things that help with that. Yeah. You don't want ice cream inside your, in your steak. You put the ice cream after. Right now, you just need the steak, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think like what has helped me over time, and like something that we try and impart on, like, I don't want to use the word students, but people that listen to us talk about it, education, I guess is probably the way to word it, is understanding like reference points and indexes. I think if you can understand reference points and index, and slowly over the course of your career start to take every single movement that we would do in the gym or during a training session, whether that's on the track or in the weight room, and start to be like, right, how many different ways, like maybe another way to look at it rather than indexes. There's a few ways we can kind of do this mental exercise. The first is like a phone book. Phone book has so I don't know, we're 15 minutes away from each other. Like I'm on Northwest 2nd and 25th. Like if so, there's a couple million people in Miami. Now, what if we had like a phone book that wasn't categorized alphabetically, that wasn't indexed, right? So if it wasn't indexed, we would just have like, I would open up the phone book and there'd be like my last name on the first page. It's like, my last name is Shallow. Why is that on the first page? All right. And then there'd be, I don't know, like your last name right after my last name. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. There are different letters that begin the last name. When people walk in the gym, it's like they're trying to call their friend, but they don't have an organized index. Right. So they're like, wait, why did you do the bicep curl before you did the barbell row or whatever, for example? Yeah. Or like, why did you do like the plyometric work like at the end of the thing? Yeah, like I would look at that and be like, that's kind of, okay, that's a little bit silly, just as silly as having Shallow on the first page of the phone book. So it's like, all right, we have all these people in Miami. We have all of these exercises in the gym. Well, if I wanted to call a business, how do I do that? It's like, well, the phone book has yellow pages and white pages. right? So that right there is an immediate, like, that's a different reference point. I'm referencing businesses versus referencing people. So it's like referencing hypertrophy is going to be different than referencing like speed and power. Right. So it's like, well, what is your reference point? It's like, are you trying to call a business or are you trying to call a person? Are you trying to get fast or are you trying to get big? Those are two different reference points. And immediately that takes, what am I looking at? Miami Auto Art. It's right across the street from me. And in true Miami fashion, the mural has a girl painted on it and her OnlyFans account with a barcode. Have you seen this, love? There's an OnlyFans barcode spray painted onto the wall of that. I swear to God, look, the logo, the OnlyFans logo is right at the bottom. I gotta make this shit up. This is Miami for you. But it's like, if I wanted to call automotives marketing, if I want to call an automotive shop, it's like, okay, I go to the sub index of businesses or the yellow pages, and then I go from there and I go to automotive. So it's like, here we have white pages, yellow pages, and then in white pages we go to, or in yellow pages we go to automotive, and then I can go through alphabetically and find Miami Auto Art. Right? So it's like, all right, so the same thing can exist of exercises. Like trunk rotation is one that we kind of talked about earlier. Right? So I can go to like, all right, do I want to talk about like resisting force or exerting force? Right? That's two different things in trunk rotation. That's like a more stable adaptation or like a more like explosive or dynamic adaptation. So it's like, well, I don't know, maybe I want resisting force. It's like, okay. Then I go to that index and then I have, based off of complexity and loadability, just an index of exercises in my brain. And I go, right, the dead bug is probably the least complex way to elicit a stimulus of anti-rotation at the trunk. So that's like page 1 or like first line under that sub-index. And then something like a single arm dumbbell row would be like pretty far down that list, depending on how you set it up and the vector of your center of mass and base support and all that. But it's very loadable, so the deviation of center of mass can be high. And then I just kind of fill things in between. And it's like, I don't know, like bear crawl and Palop press and single leg RDL. And you start to just be able to not make things absolute, but relative. Like I could say with, pretty good authority that a Palop press is relatively more difficult than a bird dog. We could look at center of mass and more importantly, deviation of base of support. Those two things combine to make how stable or unstable something is. The less stable, the more complex, the more the body's going to have to do to self-organize. So I think creating like a general model of how exercises reference to an outcome and how they relate to one another.
Right.
I think it's like the number one thing that you could do to just start to be more efficient in the decisions you make, right? Like it's no different than, like another example would be like taxonomy. Like if you've ever looked up an animal on Wikipedia, it's going to give you like a really long Latin name. And part of the Latin bits and pieces of the word are going to have to do with the phylum, the kingdom, the class, the genus, the species, the subspecies, right? Because it's not enough to just be like,
that's a cat.
There's a spot. We were in Kenya, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, and there was a spider in our room. And it's like a spider in our room in Miami is like, nah, it's a daddy long leg. There's one that lives in my bathroom. I leave it alone because it's a daddy long leg. It just chills next to the toilet. I talk to it sometimes when the wife's not around.
Phil, that's right there.
Yeah, it's Phil. Hey, what up, Phil? What up? But it's helpful to know when you're in Kenya and there's a fucking brown recluse in your tent. Right? Because the brown recluse will steal your fucking wallet and then bite your leg off, right?
Right.
So it's like, so we have daddy long leg, which is like arachna something, and then there's brown recluse, which is arachna something else.
Right.
And it's like, it's the same with exercise. It's like, there's primary and secondary and tertiary stimuli at play more than just like, this is a bicep curl. It's like, well, yeah, but what else happens at like the intervalence of the scapula and the rib cage and to a lesser degree, the pelvis, and just having these drop orders of like, rather than just classifying exercises per muscle group, being able to sub-classify them by secondary and tertiary adaptation helps you create reference points and then relate exercise to those reference points.
Yeah, I have a lot of athletes. We started with track and field. I know now I do baseball, boxing, a lot, more bigger range of things. But when we started in track and field, the model that I started to segment for the health of everything, from the hip down, mostly at tendinous tissues at the foot, was, can they take in forces? That was one segment. Can they create forces? Was another segment. Can they receive and then create forces? Was another segment. And then can they repeatedly create and receive, create and receive, create and receive? forces was another segment. So the training, programming was based on that Bill Hartman mentioned that, thing. And then that kind of just referenced the training programming was, hey, the beginning blocks are going to be about taking in forces. Then the next set of blocks is going to be about, creating force at a reactivity level. So when we did plyometrics ballistics, that's the model that we reference in order to know, like, exactly what you're saying. Like, my kids will come to me, like, oh, we have a snake in the backyard. With first question is it poisonous? Is it not poisonous? Like, those are the two main segments, right? So for track and field, it was, you're the most powerful athlete kicking the floor. You're going to be kicking the floor probably harder than anybody else. And the floor is more reactive to you than most athletes, most turfs out there, than, like, say, grass and cleats and things like that. But when they hit the ground, they get a lot of, like, plantar issues, Achilles issues, bone issues, knee, hip pains, all that stuff. So for me, it was like, I need to find a concept that can help me with that, because when I got certified, it wasn't there. So moving on to the next kind of thing is, like, now that we segment and we understand kind of where the trainers need to be and the athletes need to be, I'm going to ask you some nuanced things of training, because I have to ask this question over and over to a lot of the guests that we have on the podcast so that I can show people the concepts that we try to talk about in the gym. So here's a question you probably get all the time, but I'm going to ask it. What is an adjustment for an athlete? Yes, I know. I get athletes all the time. I had it today twice, Doc, and I'm sorry if I have to ask it, but athletes come over and they say, I don't think I don't think I should train today because I need an adjustment. It's out of place. Can you help us understand what that means? I have no idea. I honestly have no idea, because I don't have that relationship with any chiropractors that I can have these discussions. So I ask you, what does it mean when they have that?
Okay. Right. Now I'm going to give you an answer that might be unique to me only.
That's
and
okay.
maybe a few other. This is my interpretation. And it comes down to, like, bones are never the intent, right? Bones are kind of, if we look at the hierarchy of movement, bones and ligaments bones and ligaments are kind of far down the totem pole. They kind of do the bidding of fascia and tendons and muscles and ultimately the central nervous system. So I think it helps if we first frame muscles not only as, like, the things we want to get big and strong and all that, but I think it's also useful to adopt a model when you're looking at a muscle, that what you're looking at is actually a sensory organ. And I think that's a really useful way to start having this conversation. So, like, what other sensory organs do we have? Like, well, our eyes are probably our most dominant sensory organ as human beings. Like, we're very visual creatures, in the sense that, like, maybe us and snow owls and peregrine falcons are probably up there in the world as, like, visual creatures, where, I could throw a purple tennis ball on green grass and my dog can't see it, but he can smell it, or she can smell it. And they're olfactory, right? They're not optic. So they're smelling that to create and locate their environment. And just like a bat uses, like, frequency, and whales will use, like, some sort of sonar system or something, they use more vibration. It's like, yeah, we have that. Like, we have vibratory sense organs in our skin, right? But I would say our most prevalent and our most, I'm going to say powerful, and I'm going to define what I mean in a second. So our most prevalent or most powerful sensory organ that's not our eyes is our muscle. But I don't mean powerful in the sense of its ability to create force. I mean powerful in the sense of its ability to actually generate stimulus to the brain. So we have muscles in our spine that are not controlled, let's say, voluntarily, right? As we kind of sit here, we readjust in our chair. If I were to stand up, if I were to walk, basically us being biped creatures is predicated on us having a series of deep spinal muscles that attach vertebra to vertebra. And, they play a role in keeping, like, an erect, upright posture in the spine. And the way they do that is just by these voluntary contraction relaxation loops that are broadly driven by one type of muscle sensory organ. So there's two major ones. One, you guys might be familiar with the Golgi tendon organ. The Golgi tendon organ has kind of an analog at the muscle level, which is the muscle spindle. Muscle spindles are, like, what I think to be the primary player in an adjustment. So muscle spindles are the most, by orders of magnitude, the most abundant sensory receptor in the body. So there's about 50,000 muscle spindles, and that's excluding muscles in your face don't have muscle spindles. So in the rest of your body, and whatever muscles are left, there's about 50,000 of these things going around, and they sense the relative stretch and shortening of a muscle. I try to think of it almost like a finger trap, where if a muscle, imagine like something is around both of my fingers, and as I go to pull them apart, I don't actually feel the tension of the trap until I start to pull my fingers apart. That trap is almost like a muscle spindle. A muscle spindle kind of wraps around what's called an intrafusal muscle fiber, and that's like the sensory element of a muscle. So as muscles start to like stretch, or the bones ultimately are moving away from each other towards each other, there's less and greater tension, or there's more or less tension on that intrafusal muscle fiber, which signals to the respective level at the nervous system, or at the spinal cord rather, and goes, hey, if this is getting too far apart, we might want to contract the extrafusal muscle fibers around it so that we alleviate some of that tension. So let's say for those of you watching, my index fingers and my ring fingers are extrafusal muscle fibers, and my two middle fingers are intrafusal. So if, for example, these middle fingers start to slide too far apart, and that means the two bones on either end are shifting away, there's a feedback loop that goes into the nervous system that says, hey, use these extrafusal muscle fibers, because these are going away from each other, to actually contract and pull back towards. So it's an autonomic reflex, essentially, that is very much present in muscles of the deep spine. Now, the problem is if we have a lack of range of motion at a particular segment, we're going to have a respective lack of range of motion between the muscles that cross that segment, right? Whether it's a thoracic or lumbar or cervical vertebra, what have you. There's going to be, these autonomic muscles, like multifidus is a really commonly cited one. Lesser commonly cited ones are your inner transverse area, your I don't know, your semispinalis, your spinalis, your longissimus, your iliocostalis. Basically, there's one particular branch of a spinal nerve that these all are innervated by, but anything that's outside of your conscious control, like lats and rhomboids and traps and levator and all that, they're going to be they're going to be autonomically mediated. So the feeling of and that's a really good word. And I never discount when an athlete says they feel a certain way, because that's exactly what we're after. Like, they are so well in tune to how they feel that is such an important data point. If an athlete feels, if a bodybuilder feels a certain way, I don't care. I don't. Just move the thing from A to B and eat the food and get to sleep and take the drugs and whatever. I don't care. But if an athlete doesn't feel a certain way, it's a very important data point as a performance coach. So if something feels like it needs to be adjusted, likely they're not getting the sensory input from that particular group of muscle spindles so they're probably not getting the movement to allow that intrafusal extrafusal muscle relationship to activate. And you see a lot of like peripheral research pointing at a parasympathetic underlying mechanism, because there's research around adjusting that causes like transient drops in blood pressure and things of the like, probably just because that parasympathetic loops into the autonomic process of that reflex. So you're probably just stimulating a more parasympathetic response by activating these autonomic processes. It probably has nothing to do with a direct effect on baroreceptors or chemoreceptors, things that would otherwise affect blood pressure. But it is, in my eyes, it's really it's muscle mediated. And that's where, peripherally at the elbow joint or at the shoulder joint, the entirety of the control of the elbow joint or the shoulder joint or the knee joint is voluntary, right? I can opt in to flex this and strengthen that and stabilize to a certain degree this other thing. But at the level of the spine, where we see like the majority of chiropractors kind of leaning in on their adjusting, it's really more so like, how do we elicit some of these feedback loops in muscles that might be damaged, right? It's very easy to see, fat atrophy in a multifidus on a sagittal plane or a coronal plane slice of an MRI. And it's like, well, how do you elicit that response? It's like, well, maybe passively first. So then we can go through the process of active assisted or active assisted, active, and active resisted. So it's a very small piece of movement, but I think it has fairly in-depth mechanisms of correction, and I think it's something that should be not shouldn't be taken lightly, and I think should try to be understood at a deeper level, because a lot of times this idea of like, it's gas being released, like I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck if gas releases. I care if movement is present, and I care if a consequence of that movement being present is sensory perception being present, because that's what makes athletes great, is knowing where they are with, like, and you see it all the time. Listen to any call of any like LeBron James game, or watching Seth Curry or whoever. It's like the ability to do something with your eyes closed is like a signal of mastery of a thing. And it's like, well, how do you do it with your eyes closed? It's like you just have a really well-trained other predominant sensory organ, which is your muscles, right? So imagine not knowing where you were, like not knowing where your spine is, when your eyes are closed, is a big fucking problem. And that would be a big problem if anyone was just walking down the street. But imagine, trying to hit 100 plus mile an hour fastball, or trying to play 90 minutes in the World Cup, or you're going to need every little bit optimized. You're going to need that picture of your body's sensory avatar in your brain as high resolution as possible. So it's an adjunct. I think a lot of people don't think about what an adjustment is. And to me, it's an elicitation of a sensory stimulus that's muscle mediated, that allows an athlete to just restore motion, but more importantly, restore awareness and sensation at a neurophysiological level, not just like a more gross perceptual level.
But can the bones be out of place and need to be adjusted back?
No, they're not going out to lunch and stealing your credit card or anything. Like, they're not going out and going back in. They're moving well within their range of acceptable movement, given the mechanics of, we're talking spine specifically about the facet joints. They might have an inability to move out of that particular range of motion. And I think that the nuance of the language matters, because it's not stuck out, it's stuck in a normal range of motion. Like if it got there, and it wasn't like a pars interarticularis fracture or something. Like, it's okay for it to be there. It's just you're lacking some relative movement around that joint, and it's not even so much the relative movement that's top of mind for me. It's the perception and the awareness and the efficiency that comes with being aware. The efficiency is what I'm after. Because that's what makes athletes that have muscles trained in a way, like I was going to say really good proprioception or kinesthetic awareness. Athletes that pay attention to the importance of their muscles as they act as sensory organs are going to be inherently way more efficient at moving. Like, you'll see, I'm friends with Andy O'Brien, is strength coach for Sidney Crosby, and has trained Sid for the last like 16, 17 years, if not longer. Started training when he was like 14 years old. And you can see biometric data of Sid when he's on the ice. And, he's as physically conditioned as an NHL player can be. But because he's so efficient with the way he moves, he actually has a lower heart rate on the ice than most other people, because none of his muscle contractions are extraneous or compensatory. Right. They're pure signal. They're no noise. So I think that's such a thing to hone in on in the gym, is like, how can we just create this more efficient thing? So, when the brain says hand to move here, or the hand says hand to move here from a reflexive level, but there's no noise. It's all polished. It's all sharp. Like, the process of neural sharpening is a phrase that comes to mind. And I think adjusting can just be but a small part of that.
Man, thank you very much for that, Doc. I mean, that's a big factor for me. So one of the biggest things, just to recap, is making sure that the trainers start understanding a little bit more of the concepts that go into each bucket, and segmenting their different understanding of training and training models, training tools. That's super huge for me, because when I got out first certified again, I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand what I was doing, and I still don't understand a lot of what I'm doing. But I'm kind of like, I'm hitting the area. So after that, going over what the athlete needs to start doing and understanding, and a lot of the nuances that I think come up in my athletic environment is things like that. Things like the confusion of muscles. We got to confuse the muscles to get, to get things done, or I got to adjust myself because my spine is out of place and things. There's fears. A lot of what you're talking about is just, listen, these are just, it might be a fear and a feedback that your body's going through. And it turns into the same thing that happened to me, that I was stuck in one model. Because we could take this down to the spine, and we could just take it all the way out to the macro of, that's exactly what's happening to me as a trainer. I was stuck in one model, and I was just kind of just fearful of like, I think this is it, because anything else that I reach over, I don't know if I'm doing it wrong, and it doesn't feel right. Right. So I'm just going to stay in my own little area. And that just kind of ties everything down to the reason why you're on the podcast is because it kind of goes macro and micro to that point of like feedback mechanisms and all that. But how can I plug in Prescript? And tell me a little bit about how Prescript can help me, not only as a trainer, but if I'm an athlete and I'm training with a Prescript certified trainer, what are the kind of things that would help me with that educational model that you guys have?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just reproducibility, right? Like, I would rather take inaccurate reproducibility than accuracy that's inconsistent. So like, what does that mean? That's a lot of words. I would rather weigh in every morning on a scale that I know is off the same amount every morning, than like weigh in on 10 different scales in 10 different mornings. Right. So it's like, and that's the thing. It's like, we know so little about the human body. It's hilarious that any of us can do this professionally. But the way you're going to find out more is by making your decision-making processes reproducible. So like, the nice thing is it's not a system, it's not a protocol, but it's like kind of a systems way of thinking, almost like that phone book analogy. It's that for training. It's allowing you to consistently and quickly, and I think that's the big one, is quickly arrive at a decision that is, hopefully increasingly more consistent or increasingly more accurate, so that you can yield the data that making that decision affords you. Because that's the real value of a decision, is what happens after the decision's been made, right? And so it's like, if you look forward to the data of just what happens after making a decision, and you can feel confident that you're at least in the ballpark in order to make a decision, you can start making faster decisions, which means you're collecting data at a greater rate, and then you're actually improving your model better. So it's almost like the car accident model, to kind of bring this full circle. It's like, you want your training to be like a machine learning process, where if I want to plug it into a machine learning algorithm, where the result of that will then change the course of learning for my entire system, right? Rather than just getting into a fender bender and no one learns anything about why that happened, and everyone else goes out and just keeps getting into fender benders. It's like companies like Faraday or Tesla or whoever's still around in the automated car space or automated driving space, that's their challenge, is like, it's all data driven. So building the intellectual infrastructure to make decisions quickly, but understanding the purpose or the value of the decision you make is the data you get from enacting on that decision. So I think that's really what we focus on across all our curriculum, is just like, how can you think critically about making a decision-making process rather than giving you the answers for the decisions you have to make.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate that, because that's a lot of the questions that come up, is understanding the concepts. Just understand some of the concepts and we'll go from there. And a lot of the driving the car is like, you kind of want to know from the driving mode, or from, if you want to take it to the phone book analogies, you just kind of want to know like the colors. There's yellow, there's white. A lot of those things are going to be huge for me. I don't want to take too much more of your time. I know we've been here for an hour, Doc, but I want to thank you very much for that. Tell me where they can find, so the trainers that are listening to this, I want to upgrade their whatever it is, their education. Where can they find and what can they do?
Yeah, so best place website for interested in our course material, www.pre-script.com. In person, we try and keep our in-person stuff pretty exclusive. So we have 3 in-person events that are public this year. 2 are going to be in North America. 1 is going to be in Singapore. So Singapore is going to be in person on the 11th of May, or sorry, the 11th of March, May 26th, 27th. We're going to be in Seattle. But other than that, all of our courses do have an online component, and that's www.pre-grip.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Doc. Like, thank you for being here. Thank you for making the podcast. Thank you for being awesome. Thank you for like allowing us to follow you in your life story and everything that you do on your social medias. It's amazing. I appreciate your time, man.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you. We'll have to link soon.
Take care, Doc.
Cheers, brother.